Um, Welcome everyone, and thank you, Dame Judith, for that very interesting keynote. So much we could talk about following that. We've got an absolutely fantastic panel here today. It's a real privilege to be able to chair them all. I'll introduce them as we go, because I want to get right into the discussion, really. Some of the key themes that we've heard included the approach to the delivery on the requirements of the Act. We heard about the roles of data and technology, the contrast between new build and legacy, and to always keep in mind the moral imperative for change. I'd just like to invite the audience to keep in mind all the way through this session that you've got an Ask Question button at the top left. So please use that if you've got any questions for the panel, and we'll certainly try and come to those during the discussion or towards the end of the discussion. So Dame Judith said that the Act requires a change of mindset, and talked about seeing that as, or seeing that the tide is turning and that people do now recognise the need for change. So I'm curious, I want to come to Neil first. Neil Yeomans, Head of Property Safety and Technology at Orbit. Neil, you've been working on culture change for quite some time. What have you found?
Thanks, Chris. Lots of things. It's a huge topic, culture change. But one of the things I always try to do at any presentation is always to give some tangibles for people to walk away with. So I've got a couple of key messages to send on what we've discovered whilst going through our culture change. The first one is to try and give yourself as much thinking time as possible on the actual human culture change part by following a standards-led approach wherever you can. So, for any of you who've heard me speak before, you'll know what's going to come out of my mouth now. If you haven't already bought yourself a copy of BS 997, go and buy yourself one. If you haven't already got ISO 19650, go and buy that. Have a look at the UK housing data standards. Have a look at ISO 22301. Have a look at all the advice and steer that those already existing standards can provide you, so that you can build framework and actually do some tangible work that you can build a culture around. All of those are, fundamentally based on the Plan, Do, Check, Act cycle that the BSR are going to be looking for. So that's the first part. And by the way, all of this is crystallised in Orbit's building safety strategy. If anyone wants a copy of that or any of my other documents, please just touch me up on LinkedIn and I'll send them over to you via email. The second part is actually another leading light or guiding light that you can follow would be to have a look at occupational health and safety and how that works. So from anyone that works in housing, you'll know that usually the highest risk to any of our staff is going to be personal safety. Our customers can be a bit aggressive sometimes, a few, very, very few, but when it happens, it's a scary moment. The culture that is happening in occupational health and safety, and has happened for many, many years now, is the sort of culture that we are trying to bring in building safety. So with personal safety, you could probably discharge that duty by having a simple spreadsheet and a list of mobile phone numbers just to make sure that your staff clock in and clock out at the right times. But you have a look at how that thought process and that safety system has worked over the years. We now have GPS devices with accelerometers that check whether someone's fallen over. You've got two-way communication methodology through it. There isn't a piece of legislation that says you shall have to do that. That is a natural progression that when you cycle through the Plan, Do, Check, Act cycle thousands of times, that's where you get to. And so those two bits that are things that I would probably give us the tangible takeaways. Have a look at the standards that are out there, and then in terms of driving culture, try and use the occupational health and safety concept as a bit of a blueprint.
Thanks, Neil. And, I think where we'd like to go next is maybe Richard. So Richard Clark, Senior Fire Engineer at the National Fire Chiefs Council. I know, Richard, that you've got some really interesting insights here. So from the Fire and Rescue Service perspective, are you seeing the culture change?
And that's a really good question. I suppose the answer is yes and no. So there are people out there like Neil with Orbit, other housing providers who are investing a lot of time and energy into trying to kind of be at the vanguard of this regulatory change that we're seeing at the moment. There's been an early adopters group working with joint regulators group in government, trying to kind of operationalise some of the changes outlined in the Building Safety Act. And the results they're getting are mixed, because some of it's actually needed to wait for legislation to come into place before we actually understand what the direction is. It was only a couple of weeks ago where the provision of information regulations came out, which kind of encompass a lot of what the golden thread will be about. But for every proactive actor in the area, there are those who are reactive or very passive in some ways. So they're waiting to be told what to do. It's interesting, Neil mentioned things like standards. So some of the standards he outlined are very kind of engaged, proactive ones where you have to kind of outline your own safety management systems and things like that. But other things, like when you're actually designing and building a building, it may not be quite as detailed on how you need to manage that in action. And certainly the culture that's existed so far, which Dame Judith outlined in her report, is that people only do the minimum standard. They will go to the basis of what the guidance says they should and go from there, rather than kind of pay heed to things like functional requirements or requirements in fire risk assessments, which say that you should actually adapt and improve your buildings as technology progresses, which Neil outlined in his piece as well.
Thanks, Richard. So Paul Nash, Director of Paul Nash Consulting, what's your perspective on the cultural and behavioural changes required?
Well, Chris, I think it's always helpful to remember why this change was necessary, and also to recognise that the issues identified by Dame Judith in the Building a Safer Future report actually go back way before Grenfell. We know about the fire at Lakenham House in 2009, where 6 people lost their lives, the wall collapse at Oxgang's school, and Professor John's chilling comment actually that it wasn't down to the luck and timing, the outcome could have been very different. So we knew there was an issue with quality and building safety before Grenfell, and tragically, of course, it took 72 people to lose their lives to bring about the type of systemic change that we're talking about today. Back in 2017, the Chartered Institute of Building actually established a commission to look into this issue and what needed to change. And fundamentally, we reached the same conclusion as Dame Judith, which was there was a systemic problem, and there was a race to the bottom with insufficient focus on quality and ultimately delivering buildings that were safe. So yes, it was clear there's a need for legislative change, but we also needed to confront the behaviours that were promoting that race to the bottom. And I think that begins by recognising that we all have a responsibility, a legal one and a moral responsibility, to ensure that the buildings that we design, we procure, we construct and we operate are safe for those who use them. Of course, that requires competent people. So people with the right skills, knowledge, experience, and of course the right behaviours as well. And it also requires organisations that employ those people to be competent and to actively promote the right behaviours from their employees. Of course, sometimes that means you have to be prepared to challenge bad practice. You have to be prepared sometimes to say, no, that's not the right thing to do. So fundamentally, I think culture change will only happen in this industry if there's moral leadership. But that's absolutely essential, of course, if we're going to avoid another Grenfell Tower fire.
Yeah, absolutely, Paul. Dame Judith described this as an outcome-based framework and said that we can't expect the regulator to tell us what to do. In fact, she said the extent to which the regulator will tell industry what to do is going to be less than ever before. So given this, I mean, how should the industry be approaching delivery requirements of the Act? Aman Sharma, Chief Executive at Totus Digital, there does seem still to be some uncertainty about which buildings this applies to and what applies to which category of buildings. And Dame Judith reminded us of the principles here apply to all buildings, but application of those principles varies with the risks. I wonder, could you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. I think it's quite telling that we're in November 2023 and we're still having to make that clarification on exactly what the Building Safety Act covers and to whom the Building Safety Regulator will be taking a fundamental interest in, because the answer is very clear. And I think the answer has been very clear for a number of years, actually. And you don't have to have been overly close to the conversation, either at a government level or industry body level, to have known that. This is a building safety regulator that intends to regulate all buildings across the built environment in the English regulatory regime. And there are levers within the Building Safety Act that place a more onerous design and construction process on what we now refer to as higher risk buildings, both for in occupation, which is the coverage that we look at under Part 4 of the Building Safety Act, and for those going through their development process, which is broadly what we describe as the Part 3 requirements colloquially. That being said, I think the bit, Chris, that people seem to often either mistake or perhaps deliberately overlook, the head in the sand brigade, as Dame Judith likes to informally call them, is the fact that the very real fact that there are additional vires and mechanisms within the Building Safety Act to extend this regime over time. There is no appetite to have an ongoing two-tier process for the design and construction of one building typology by function of trigger height, and leave another, flawed building control regime in place for the rest of the built environment. And this, I guess, comes back to that generational opportunity that Dame Judith referred to in her speech, because if we recognise this as a generational opportunity, or a once in a generation opportunity, I should say, I think we have to come to the conclusion that it does require the effort of a generation to put that into place. And I think this might come back to how we are framing this conversation. We are no longer talking about concepts and principles. We're in this thing now. It's live, it's around us, and it's happening. And I would like to see a bit of a shift in the culture in terms of how we are describing these new requirements, and migrating ever so slightly further away from risk-based conversation, or a risk aversion, to trying to mitigate these new requirements at an organizational level, and actually thinking more about introducing opportunities into how businesses are conducting themselves and operating their existing HRBs. What potential opportunities can be realized once you accept that this change is a systemic change, both in the behaviors that we are asking to be demonstrated to not just the regulator, but of course our residents as well, but also in the skill, knowledge and experience that we're asking our teams to deploy too. So I think there's a great deal, obviously, in amongst all of that, but absolutely, Chris, it starts with understanding what's in the content of the primary legislation, in this case, the Building Safety Act, and the additional detail that was always purposefully going to cascade through into the secondary, which, as Richard reminds us, is now finally all in the public domain.
Thanks, Aman. And just a reminder to everybody, we have the Ask a Question button, top left-hand corner, if you've got any questions for the panel. I'd like to introduce our last panelist, so Steve Verge, Technical and Delivery Manager at Symmetry. Steve, what can be done from a digital perspective here?
Yeah, I mean, we've already mentioned, and Neil, when he started looking at this, was the standards that are already embedded within the way we're working today. For the last, 10, 15 years, BIM has been a focus really of how we manage data, but I think it's now becoming more and more clear that that data needs to be correctly stored. And we've got digital processes and workflows now to establish the right data that's needed for the right people. Dame Judith started talking about managing our change control and change management. That should all be in the digital process as well. So we've got that recorded. We've got to start working more and more collaborative together, because we're going to see contractors getting early engagement, because they've really got to do any value engineering and anything really early. So if they can really get engaged, they have to get engaged before the gateway to submissions, because that's actually what they've got to build from. The digital process that embeds and stores all the information behind it really has to be at the key of everything we're delivering today. Yeah,
thanks, Stephen. And Dame Judith talked about the need for a very, very good record-keeping system. It's always nice to see that emphasis. Very, very good, not just even good or very good, a very, very good record-keeping system, but also that it's a great opportunity for BIM and digital to make inroads into the sector. And she talked about it as an opportunity to leave that race to the bottom behind as well. So, Richard, maybe we can come back to you. You previously talked about the challenge, not just of getting the data, but of what people are then able to do with it. Can you say a bit more about that?
Yeah, from a fire and rescue service perspective, it's interesting. So we've always gathered data on risks within our communities, but there's never been a kind of proactive requirement for people to send information to us, which the various pieces of legislation over the past couple of years has brought about. So the Fire Safety England regulations require fault notifications, and the recent regulations that I mentioned earlier will actively require people to push information to us. So one of the challenges I think within fire services is kind of getting that information in a usable format and then processing it internally. So as part of the phase 1 recommendations of Grenfell Tower, it was highlighted that actually the information communication in various parts of fire services can be problematic. So one of the challenges is to kind of understand what information is coming to us, trying to ask for that data in a usable format. So one of the requirements for things like building plans, that's met with various success in the sense that we can either get very simple line drawings that is outlining guidance, or some people will send us a PDF of an architect's plan that has too much information really for the purposes of, say, an operational response. I think fire services are quite unique in the sense that we need to be able to use data in a number of formats, whether that's for regulation or for operational crews. But it's also the challenges that come with data are things like keeping it up to date, cleansing information as it comes in, what to retain and for how long. And that's going to become even more of a challenge in future when we're getting information around residents themselves, so those with different evacuation needs. As part of the evacuation strategies, that information may come through to us. So it's highlighting whether we need to pass that on to operational crews for a response, to send it to our prevention teams who may be able to carry out some sort of safe and well visit for a person-centered risk assessment. But it's the challenge is getting accountable persons, responsible persons to understand what we need. Also getting fire services to understand what accountable persons can provide, because Neil and his colleagues don't want to be sending various different formats of information to 43 different fire and rescue services. They want kind of a one way of doing it to minimise costs and be proportionate.
Yeah. Steve, what role do you see the technology playing in all of this?
Yeah, I mean, Dame Judith mentioned the golden thread, and many of us are talking around the golden thread these days. And technology is at the heart of this, because we've got to look at how the workflow of information goes from design through construction to the owner operator of that building, but also to the residents, because they have a right to be able to see how their apartment or anything's been built as well. So technology and software platforms are going to be at the heart of everything. And we've got to look at ensuring we have that single source of truth right the way through the design. But at the same time, that information, as Richard just said, is available to the right people at the right time. The workflow that we've got now is quite still siloed, where that's now got to open up, because we've literally got to have the workflow and embed it between all the different parties and capture things that we're doing in construction. It mentions in the Act that we must start submitting as-built information. I mean, as soon as you mention that to a lot of people, it's like, oh no, we don't do as-builts. It's construction intent and construction records and things like that. Why? We should be building the buildings from the design and specs which we're submitting, and that's what Gateway 2 is trying to push us into. And it's really great now that we're beginning to see technology capture this data and provide that data to all the parties to show how we're actually building these buildings and proving that we're building it against the spec and regulations to make these things safer for us all to live in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of chat in the audience, and we've got a question around how the industry can leave behind this race to the bottom when procurement methods kind of seem to continue to encourage it. And Neil, I'd like to come to you. I mean, you've been at Orbit pioneering some of this application of BIM and some of the standards you mentioned, and establishing CDEs and all of these things. What have you found in terms of the appropriate use of technology, and particularly if you want to comment on that procurement question, what needs to change? That would be interesting too.
Yeah, it's a perfect timing of that question, Sue. So we completed a BIM pilot. I don't know, it must be 9 months or so ago now on 3 of our HRBs to test out where we think the BIM technology needs to be and that the BIM methodology needs to be. We philosophically, we see the biggest problem not in the collection of the data, but actually in the maintenance of the data and the utility of the data over 100 years. That's the real true philosophical change. How am I supposed to give someone in my position in 40 years a fighting chance to know what they need to be doing to that building in 40, 50 years' time? It's a really different way of working. So we coupled up with a company called Parametrics to do a BIM pilot on 3 of our buildings, and we trialed out 3 different levels. We actually used our current asset management system as a data architecture, an AIR for those BIM inclined, and then we also used COBE and the UK Housing Data Standards, and we compared the 3 of those suites, and we found that the UK Housing Data Standard held far more of what we needed than the other standards did. It was much more useful. So one of the things that we're now doing is we're rolling that out to the other 23 of our HRBs, again with Parametrics, which brings me on to the procurement methodology. To answer your question specifically, Sue, we used the collaborative procurement guidance that was released back in January 22 by the government. We used that as a bit of an inspiration on how we procured our BIM suite, our BIM partner. And I'm actually giving the speech on it next Thursday at the Association of Safety and Compliance Professionals, if you want any more detail. But what we did is we broke, instead of going down the traditional route of quality cost split, we went down the route of quality, safety, cost, and then implementation plan. So we ended up, the cost was actually only representative of about 35%, but we had minimum of 30% specifically on safety-based, open safety-based questions that looked at how they interpret the Building Safety Act and what their systemic safety systems looked like. And it led to us actually ended up with the most expensive contractor. So it was the opposite of a race to the bottom, because of the answers that they were able to give. We really tested out the safety credentials. One of the bidders literally put our methodologies are so sound we have made no changes since the Building Safety Act was introduced. So that was the sort of thing. Compare that to, we had an amazing answer from the contractor we ended up with. So anyway, that document's a really useful lodestone that we used.
Yeah, very helpful, Neil. Thank you for sharing that experience you've had. Paul, I know you've done some thinking as well around this supply chain engagement and what getting better information in our systems from the start might have in terms of implications for the supply chain engagement. Can you add a bit of colour to that?
Yeah, I think, it's quite helpful, I think, to look at, in the context of the new building control regime in particular, and it's already been mentioned, Gateway 2, because that's saying very clear to clients that you're now responsible. You're responsible to ensure that people you employ are competent. You're responsible to ensure the information that you and your professional team provide as part of the building control application demonstrates how you're going to comply with building regs. And of course, that information needs to be submitted digitally or electronically at least. So by definition, that implies early engagement with the supply chain, particularly tier 1 contractors, and that expertise that they hold both within their teams and in their supply chain. My background is project management. I candidly have always advised my clients that early engagement with the supply chain is the right way to go. I think now under the new regime, I don't think that's a choice. I think one thing I would just say though, I think we have to be mindful, and I can think of one specific example where this happened, that we don't create unintended barriers to entry with the supply chain. We've got to remember that this industry is predominantly characterised by SMEs. So whatever technology systems we give have got to be affordable, accessible, practical solutions. No sledgehammers to crack nuts here, guys, because we won't achieve what we want to. I think also there's an interesting, coming back to the procurement point that's just been made, and I could wax lyrical about that because it's something I've given a lot of thought to over the last 5 years. But I think one of the things this is going to drive is a move away from what we call contractors' design portion supplements. For a long time now, what we've seen is what I've referred to as kicking the can down the road in terms of procurement, with the minimum amount of design being done and then being thrown over to the contractor to develop during construction. I want to be absolutely clear on this call, that will no longer work under this regime because you won't get full gateway 2. So I think that's something worth reflecting on. So we will see changes in procurement methodology. I think to Neil's point, he's right. There was some very good work done by Trowse and Hamlin on price evaluation, for example. Good report, a white paper, which identified the different ways of evaluating price by different behaviours from the supply chain. So I think this is a really key area. If we're going to drive the right behaviours, we have to understand how procurement needs to change to respond to this new regime.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. Aman, you work with a lot of clients on helping them through this journey. How are you seeing their use of technology?
I think it very much is driven at a strategic level. There has to be buy-in at the most senior parts of these organizations to enable that change, that proportionate change to take place. I mean, technology is a slightly evocative word insofar as what we're sort of talking about, because everyone's got a different perspective on exactly what that looks like. And Paul helpfully reminds us that, you know, the vernacular that the legislation refers to is electronic, and that's purely just because there's legal precedence for electronic being used, where it is trying to very prescriptively point to the fact that what we don't mean is paper. And I think that's pretty much what we're trying to remind the industry of. But we as an organisation, as an individual, I'm a big champion of digital innovation. I come from an industry that has not been very good at it, quite frankly. We've been so bad at it, even where we have had a duty to manage information in exactly the way that we are being asked to now under the golden thread, albeit without that electronic caveat to the nuances of this policy, and we failed. And Dame Judith showed us the quantum of that failure. It goes back, I think, to what does a good client organisation look like, and what are the rules that they are setting internally, which they can then cascade down through their supply chains and their internal teams as well, as to what a proportionate step change looks like to move to, you know, whatever they're referring to it internally as a digital strategy or whatever it might be. Notwithstanding that when a number of us on this panel, but also I suspect a fair few within the audience as well, will have contributed to the government's work many years ago to develop those 10 principles under BRAC's Golden Thread report. And of course, one of them was to ensure that we weren't snookering ourselves by creating a specific and proprietary-led solution that would be accidentally engineered into those regulations. And I think actually you can see that has been carried through quite well actually in the development of those relevant regulations, such that, you know, we are unpacking some of those high-level concepts that we were talking around. And I think that's probably a very long-winded way of saying that most organisations who are approaching this in a pragmatic and an innovative way are developing their own organisation-centric solutions, irrespective of the tools that they are using, irrespective of the processes that they are taking. What's worked for Orbit has worked for Orbit, and that's absolutely fantastic, because they've taken in, you know, that this is how we, what is our benchmark, and, you know, what are we trying to achieve? Where do we want to get to? They're not looking over the fence necessarily and trying to do a copy and paste of their peers, because that's not what that's not what they've been encouraged to do, rightly so. And I would hope that, you know, tenets like technology and everything else that we could discuss in the context of information management, particularly digital information management, follows that same philosophical approach. You know, businesses need to look internally and ask themselves, what do we need? You know, what works for us, and what is, you know, from a cost benefit perspective, what is proportionate to implement at scale.
Thanks, Aman. So as we kind of move forwards from there and start thinking about the distinction that Dame Judith meant between kind of new build and legacy, and she talked about starting with digital from day one on the new builds, but recognizing the challenges with existing buildings, but also, you know, making it clear that defending past poor practice by saying we do not have anything is not going to be good enough. We've got to get the due diligence in place on those legacy buildings. So maybe coming back to you, Aman, one of the most obvious differences in the way between legacy and new is that legacy buildings have already got residents in them. So how do we include the residents in this new future?
Yeah, it's a good question. What I would suggest that a proportion of our existing buildings will also be multi-occupancy, higher risk buildings as well. So there'll be interfaces with other occupancy profiles, but predominantly, yes, that's correct. By very definition, our higher risk buildings will be will have that sort of profile that we refer to as resident or customers, depending on the terms being used by the principal accountable person, and it's a timely reminder that we don't talk about building safety as it relates to the regulations that we've been unpacking in silo or isolation. The golden thread, and Judith does a very good job when she speaks publicly and in reminding us, is the underpinning tenet to this regime. The concept of information management and using information as a commodity, something that actually has a value in and of itself, is something that I repeat as frequently as I can, because historically, pointing back to previous culture, we look at information as a byproduct of an action. And I'm not suggesting that's the approach that's taken by those in this audience, because this is a very informed and intelligent audience when it comes to information management. Sadly, that's not reflective and hasn't been reflective in the wider industry, including fire engineers, of course, as well. So it's moving that conversation into, okay, well, if that is the case and we are considering data and information to have that fundamental value to it, where are we trying to get it to? And that comes back to one of the other golden thread principles, of course, that accessibility, that usability, etc., etc. And residents ultimately are at the heart of why we're doing this thing. We are here because something unspeakable and unthinkable happened on the 14th of June 2017, and we are trying our hardest to make sure it doesn't happen again. And if we take our eye off the fact that there is one group in particular that should be front of mind whenever we're having these conversations, then we are already starting to get this thing wrong. And when we think about our resident engagement strategies, which is the term I want to sort of come to, we need to be thinking about what's informing those strategies. Where is that information coming from to help flesh those strategies out? But what also is the throughput? How do specific people within your buildings make use of that information? What level of information are you getting to them? Because some of my senior relatives living in higher risk buildings don't want to see GAs, and they don't want to see some of the complex information that may or may not be captured in a model. They may have a very specific question, and they have an absolute right to get that information in a format that they can understand. That's where we're trying to get to, that resident-centric focus piece to this. And again, as I say, we can talk all for the rest of the day about gateways and design and construction, but ultimately, whether we're talking about Part 3 requirements of the Building Safety Act or the Part 4, they are at the absolute centre of this.
Yeah, thanks, Aman. And hopefully many of the audience will have heard the amazing story that Charlotte Bates related in the opening keynote this morning, and her experiences as a social tenant. And I think what you said there absolutely resonates with that and brings forward all of her comments into this building safety context. I'd like to come to you, Richard, next. What are the challenges of competence you see in the fire and rescue service, particularly with respect to legacy buildings?
I think legacy buildings are going to be interesting within the scope of the Building Safety Act, because it talks about two different building safety risks, one which is fire spread and the other is structural safety. As you saw in Dame Judith's presentation, the idea behind that is having layers of safety, the Swiss cheese model. And a lot of our legacy buildings are solely reliant on compartmentation, pretty much, as their main way of ensuring safety for residents. So I think the safety case regime will bring up a lot of considerations in this area. And one of the key things is going to be having people who are competent and able to actually assess buildings. So it's not just a case of, in the past, we've always said a building was built like that 40 years ago, and now it's safe. Now it'd be a question of saying, why is it safe? So can an opening vent, a window, be a safe form of smoke control in an existing building? do we need to think about retrofitting safety features like sprinklers, because that's the way of adding an extra layer to that safety calculation within it. And I think competency across the board is going to be an issue there. So it's not just from people in private industry, it's going to be down to fire and rescue services to actually be able to challenge appropriately and proportionately. And I think that's going to be one of the greater decisions further on, is if you look at what's happened up till now around things like the fire risk assessments of external wall systems, there's been quite a delay in that due to the lack of industry competence to be able to assess it. It's a high degree of competence that's required, and getting the people who are able to do that resiliently and actually providing a proportionate response that isn't just strip buildings of combustible cladding and replace it with non-combustible is difficult. And I think that's going to be one of the main challenges in future.
Yeah, thank you, Richard. Steve, we hear a lot about what's different between new build and legacy, but I wonder, what do they have in common?
I mean, we must bring this back to basics. What we're trying to do here is ensure that the buildings we're living in are safe, and the common between the legacy and the new builds is information capture now. We've got a great opportunity of our new builds to capture the right data that we need for the industry, for all the parties. And that's a foundation really for us to start building on the legacy buildings. How much of those legacy buildings do we actually know what changes happened in them? And I think it's now the time to start acting upon that, so we can capture that change digitally, electronically, and get that information over to the right people to protect more and more people out there. So for me, the common is information. It's at the heart of everything we should be doing now. And let's use it to protect others as we move forward.
So if we're going to be, as Dame Judith said, a part of making this new system work and work collaboratively and show leadership and call out all behaviours and do this without being told what to do, but instead being measured on the outcomes we achieve, then I wonder kind of how do we even measure success? Paul, I wonder whether I can come to you. What does collaboration look like in practice, and how does digital support that?
Well, I think true collaboration really starts with a common purpose, doesn't it? And a recognition, in my experience, that to get the best and the right outcome out of people, you need to draw on a range of skills, knowledge, and expertise. I've worked on a number of projects and where that's happened, and unsurprisingly, those ones are the successful ones. So in my experience, it's often useful to look at where projects go wrong, and very often that's because the expectations that are set from the outset are wrong. A badly defined brief, unrealistic program, insufficient budget. And the problem with those projects, of course, is you're always on the back foot. You're always ultimately trying to justify poor decision making. So I think the role of digital technology is key in terms of supporting collaboration by from an information point of view, because it's well used and I've been using it for probably 15, 20 years to manage information on projects, to that, as Steve referred to earlier, that sort of single source of the truth, which is one of the core principles of effective project management. But that doesn't solve the problem of bad decision making. So maybe there's another conversation to be had here about the role that AI could play in the future, helping decision makers to make more informed decisions based on data rather than optimism bias, as I think it's referred to.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. Neil, let's come back to you. When we're looking at kind of how do we make this work, who are the leaders that we can look to? I mean, you've done some amazing things at Orbit, but where can people look to see who's doing the right things?
Good question. Very, very good question. I think the reason it's a good question is actually there is so much activity that it's quite hard to go across all of it. The number of events that I get to speak at is simply because of the number of people that are creating and trying to create a leadership space in this area. Obviously, I'm going to plug the National Housing Federation's Building Safety Group, which I'm fortunate to chair. That page on the National Housing Federation's website has some information on there. There's some more detail on the case study on the BIM project that we did. but other organisations do it, and that's got a whole host of heads of service and directors from across housing associations on there. But beyond that, there's lots of activity. So the ASCP, which is the Association of Safety and Compliance Professionals, is one of the ones that I'd point to be a really interesting one, because that's one of the few organisations that has clients, as in housing associations and private sector landlords, and also supply chain. So you've got everyone from gas engineers through to architects that are members. So that's another area that I'd have a look at. But the overall message I'd give is we're at an invention of a wheel time. We are going to all be potentially leaders in this if we pull together and we collaborate. There is no need for a North Star person. It should be that if we all follow the Plan, Do, Check, Act continuous improvement cycle and we all share the learnings that we have, we can all be leading the way on it.
Thanks, Neil. You creating the wheel. I'm reminded of that cartoon that I'm sure you've all seen, of the kind of 4 people pushing along a cart with square wheels on it, and somebody stood at the side with like, here's a round wheel, and everybody like, we're too busy, go away. So hopefully it won't play out like that. So we're coming towards the end now, and what I'd like to do is just quickly go around you all, because you've provided so many fantastic insights today, and really just ask what will be your one key takeaway from Dame Judith's keynote or the discussion over the last 40 minutes or so. So you're going to have to keep it brief, 30 seconds or so. So there's your challenge. And we'll start with Richard.
I think my key takeaway is when Dame Judith talked about the onus and responsibility of doing the right thing rests with duty holders and not regulators. I think in the past, people have been quite passive and waited for regulators to tell them what to do. And now it's actually on people to do the right thing. And that's where the culture change will come from.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you, Richard. Paul.
Chris, I think the key message for me is let's never lose sight of why we're doing this. I mean, it's the point's been well made throughout this presentation. It is, and it always should be, about ensuring the buildings that we create and we manage are safe for those who use them, because we can never have another Grenfell. So everything we've talked about on this call and more really is the message I'd like people to take away from this.
Thank you, Paul. Great advice. Steve, how about you? What's your takeaway for people?
Yeah, I think just embrace the standards. They're there for a reason, and they're there to help and guide us. And let's look at the new technology that's there to help us capture the information quicker, smarter, and let's share the data between us all.
Wonderful. Collaboration at the heart there. Okay. Aman, how about you?
So I think my main message would be just a reminder, and Judith alluded to it towards the end of her discussion, is that this is very much the end of the beginning as opposed to the beginning of the end. We are simply dealing with milestones here. I probably shouldn't promote the fact that I chair the approved document B technical review, and I only mentioned that because she alluded to second stairs. This is a homogenous piece. Building safety is not myopic in its very definition, and we have done a great deal as an industry collectively to get to this point. But we've got so much more to do, and information management will play an absolute centric part to that. And I know everyone will want to play their part and keep up that effort.
Thank you. And last but not least, Neil.
Yeah, so everyone's stolen all my takeaways, yeah?
Exactly, yeah. You're right, Neil. You've got something else, I know it.
Well, I mean, the reason, just building off the last two, the reason that we know we're at the beginning of a journey is actually the thing I took away. The reason we know we're at the beginning of a journey is because the world that Dame Judith has come from has already walked this journey for their disciplines. Occupational health and safety, the chemical industry, the oil industry, the aviation industry, they have had their moments, and they have they're a large way in their journey. And I suppose the final point would be that the journey doesn't actually have an end. I think that's one of the conceptual things to get around. The Plan, Do, Check, Act cycle is a continuous improvement cycle, and it has the word continuous in it because it never ends. And I'm just excited by where we're going to be in a decade's time.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, panel. Richard, Paul, Steve, Aman, and Neil. Fantastic conversation. We're coming to a break now.